On a white marble wall in Manila, a name is carved and left alone. William Everett Gray. No photograph. No date beyond 11 June 1944. In Morristown, New York, a cenotaph stands empty, brushed clean each spring by his mother, Catherine Gray, who once said, "If he comes home, he'll know where to find us." The file calls him non-recoverable. An administrative verdict, not a human one. I can't pretend I know what it felt like to wait beside a grave with nothing in it. But I can see what remains. A name in stone, a locked door, and a day that never moved on. William Everett Gray woke before the town did. In Morristown, the mornings had a sound to them, screen doors clicking shut, a delivery truck coughing awake down by the river, the long whistle of the first freight cutting through fog off the street Lawrence. William tied his shoes at the foot of his bed and checked the knot twice. He ran the same route every morning, out past Chippewa Street Cemetery, along the road where the maples leaned low, then back again before breakfast. He liked the way the gravel shifted underfoot, the way breath settled into rhythm after the first mile. Running was a habit that didn't require permission. Catherine Gray watched from the kitchen window without saying anything. She was used to seeing him pass tall, careful with his stride, already carrying himself like someone expected to be trusted. She kept the kettle on longer than necessary, waiting for the sound of the gate. When he came in, he always said the same thing. "Morning, Ma?" And she always answered, "You'll catch cold if you don't slow down." He smiled and dried his hair with the same towel he'd used since high school. William was the late child, the careful one. Catherine and Frank Gray were older parents, measured in their movements, precise in their expectations. His sister Catherine had been an adult by the time he learned to walk. She had changed his diapers, corrected his homework, and taught him how to iron a shirt without leaving a crease down the sleeve. In the family, he was handled gently, like something that had arrived unexpectedly but was never treated as a mistake. On the morning he decided to leave, nothing dramatic happened. That mattered later. He ate toast with butter scraped thin. He folded the newspaper once, then twice, then put it down without finishing the front page. The decision had already been made. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. Catherine noticed first. She always did. "You're packing again," she said, leaning against the doorframe of his room. "Just sorting," William replied, though the suitcase was already open on the bed. Inside it, he placed things with intention. 2 shirts. 1 pair of trousers he didn't mind ruining. A fountain pen he'd received for finishing a semester with honors. And the small notebook, thin, leather-bound, no more than 100 pages, that he slid into the inside pocket of his jacket. He had bought it in town without telling anyone, paying in cash, as if secrecy made the choice easier. The notebook wasn't for heroics. It held grocery lists, fragments of lectures, a sketch of the river bend near Morristown that he'd never finished shading. On the first page, he had written his name twice, once neatly, once as if testing how fast he could make the letters go. Catherine stood in the doorway longer than Catherine did. "You don't have to rush," she said. "I won't," he answered, which was true in the narrow sense. He wasn't rushing. He was steady. There were reasons William chose the Marine Corps that didn't fit into speeches. He had been restless at college, distracted by the sense that he was preparing for a future that might not wait. He liked order, but not confinement. He liked being part of something that required discipline without explaining itself every day. When he learned that aviation needed officers who could think quickly and take responsibility without flinching, it felt like an answer he didn't need to justify. He didn't talk about fear, but it was there, tucked into small behaviors. He checked doors twice. He rewrote letters before sending them. He ran longer when he couldn't sleep. Once, late in the evening, Catherine found him standing in the yard, staring up at the stars as if counting them. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making sure they're still where they should be," he said, half joking. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like to stand on the edge of leaving with everyone watching you try not to show it. But I can see how William practiced being calm the way other people practice speeches." The letter to his mother was written on a Sunday afternoon, after church, when the house was quiet enough to hear the clock in the hallway mark each minute. He wrote slowly, pressing the pen harder than usual. He told her not to worry if there were gaps between letters. He told her the training would be demanding, that time would fold in on itself. He didn't mention danger. Instead, he mentioned weather and schedules, and the way mail sometimes lagged behind good intentions. "Don't count the days," he wrote. Count the weeks. It feels kinder that way. Catherine read that line more than once. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beneath the telephone, the one she checked before bed every night. Frank Gray listened more than he spoke. He had worked most of his life with his hands and believed in letting decisions show themselves over time. On the evening before William left for training, Frank handed him a pocket watch, plain, heavy, scratched at the edge. "It doesn't keep perfect time," he said. "That's all right," William replied. Frank nodded. That was the end of the conversation. The town gathered for him in the way small towns do, without announcements. Someone brought a pie. Someone else shook his hand a little too hard. At the station, the air smelled of oil and damp wood. The platform was uneven. Boards worn thin by decades of departures that all felt different until they didn't. Catherine stood a few steps back, arms crossed, saying nothing. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. When William turned, she reached into her purse and pressed a handkerchief into his palm. "You'll forget this," she said. "I won't," he answered, folding it carefully and placing it beside the notebook. The train pulled away with a jerk that made Catherine step forward without realizing she had moved. William leaned out the window just long enough to raise his hand. It wasn't a wave so much as a signal. "I see you." Then he was gone. Training changed his handwriting first. The letters came faster, tighter, as if space had become scarce. He wrote about routines, inspection lines, early mornings that made Morristown feel far away, the way engines sounded different depending on who was listening. He never complained. When Catherine wrote back asking what it was like to fly, he answered with a single sentence: "It makes the ground feel less permanent." He kept the notebook with him, updating it when he could. Names of men he trusted. A diagram of an aircraft cockpit drawn from memory. A list titled after, with 3 items beneath it: home, river, cake for Ma. He crossed nothing out. When his commission came through, Catherine pinned the clipping to the corkboard in the kitchen. Second lieutenant. She traced the letters with her finger, then wiped the board clean around it so the notice stood alone. Frank adjusted his glasses and read it twice. Catherine smiled in a way that held both pride and worry, the two emotions never fully separating. The last visit home was brief. William had learned to pack faster, speak less. He walked his running route once more, slower this time, noticing the cracks in the pavement he'd memorized without meaning to. At the cemetery, he stopped and read the family names carved into stone, tracing the letters of his grandparents with his thumb. He didn't say anything about it when he returned. That night, Catherine cooked too much food. William ate more than he wanted to. They talked about ordinary things, weather, repairs, the neighbor's new fence, until Catherine finally said what everyone had been circling. "When do you come back?" He paused. "After," he said, and smiled as if the word could stretch to cover everything. The fear he carried wasn't of dying. It was smaller, sharper. The idea of becoming a line in a ledger without context. He addressed envelopes carefully, adding middle initials, making sure dates were clear. Names mattered. He had learned that early. When he left the second time, there was no crowd. Just Catherine at the door, Frank seated at the table, Catherine holding herself still. William picked up his jacket, checked the notebook was where it belonged, and placed the pocket watch in his breast pocket. "I'll write," he said. "We'll wait," Catherine replied. Outside, the morning had already begun. The sound of his footsteps faded down the road he had run so many times, the route etched into muscle memory. Morristown settled back into itself, holding his place without knowing how long it would need to. The telegram arrived, folded like it already knew it would be opened more than once. Catherine Gray stood at the small table beneath the hallway clock, reading the words without moving her lips. "Missing in action." The phrase sat in the room without sound, heavier than the kettle on the stove, heavier than the chair she reached for when her knees weakened. She did not cry. She pressed the paper flat with both hands, smoothing a crease that refused to disappear. Frank came in from the yard with dirt still on his cuffs. "What is it?" he asked. She handed him the telegram. He read it slowly, then once more, as if the meaning might shift under pressure. "They don't say dead," he said. "No," Catherine answered. The clock on the wall marked the minute, then the next. After that day, no one wound it again. It stayed fixed, hands frozen just past 8, a small decision that no one announced. The room adjusted around it. William's name was spoken carefully in the house. as if volume mattered. Catherine folded his last letter and placed it back in its envelope, then into the drawer beneath the telephone where Catherine kept the earlier ones. Mail became an event measured in footsteps to the porch and back. When nothing came, Catherine still sorted the paper, still checked the return addresses twice. There were no witnesses who could say what happened. No man returned to describe seeing William's aircraft fall. No voice to offer a final detail that could settle into certainty. The squadron's commanding officer wrote a letter that said very little and apologized for saying so. "We continue to hope," he wrote. Frank read that line aloud once, then nodded as if hope were a task to be completed. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to wait on a word that may never arrive. But I can see how waiting changes behavior." Catherine kept the porch light on through the night. Catherine began setting an extra plate at dinner and removing it only after the food cooled. Frank sat closer to the radio, adjusting the dial even when it carried no news. The absence of information became its own routine. Each morning followed the same pattern. Check the mailbox, check the phone, return to the kitchen. Catherine wrote letters to addresses she had copied carefully from official replies. She learned how to phrase questions without sounding impatient. She learned how to end sentences without asking for more than the writer could give. One afternoon, a second telegram came. It did not add details. It repeated the classification. Catherine clenched her jaw hard enough that her head ached. "They don't know anything," she said. "They will," Frank replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Neighbors spoke in lowered tones. Someone suggested William might have parachuted into jungle terrain and was waiting to be found. Someone else mentioned prisoners being held longer than expected. Catherine listened without correcting anyone. Possibility, even fragile, was still something to hold. The house changed around the waiting. William's room remained untouched. Shoes aligned where he had left them, the smell of soap lingering longer than it should have. Catherine opened the door once a week to air it out, careful not to disturb the bedspread. She found the handkerchief she had given him tucked into the pocket of a jacket he had left behind. She folded it again and placed it in her dresser, unable to explain why. Frank's health declined quietly. He stopped working in the garden at midday. He slept in his chair more often, the radio murmuring beside him. When Catherine suggested a doctor, he shook his head. "Not until we hear," he said. Letters from the military arrived with increasing formality. Dates replaced names. Catherine learned acronyms she did not want to know. Each envelope carried weight beyond its paper. She opened them with a letter opener she had inherited from her mother, the blade dull from years of safe use. One letter explained the review process. Another asked for dental records. Catherine searched through drawers until she found an old envelope with a dentist's name written in pencil. She mailed it the same day, standing at the post office counter, until the clerk took it from her hand. The idea that someone, somewhere, was looking gave structure to the waiting. When Catherine suggested they mark time on the calendar, Catherine refused. "He said not to count the days," she said. Catherine nodded. She remembered that line too. Frank died the following year, seated at the kitchen table with the newspaper folded open in front of him. The headline had nothing to do with William. The doctor spoke softly about the heart, about age. Catherine listened without interrupting. When it was over, she stood in the doorway and looked at the chair where Frank had waited every evening, convinced that certainty would arrive if he remained in place long enough. At the funeral, someone asked if there had been word about her son. Catherine shook her head. "He's still out there," she said. The sentence ended the conversation. After Frank's death, the classification changed. Catherine received a letter explaining the legal necessity of a finding. It used careful language, respectful and firm. William was presumed dead. The date was fixed. Catherine pressed the paper flat and placed it with the others. She did not remove the porch light. Catherine watched her mother age in increments, measured by mail delivery. Catherine's hair went white quickly. She moved more slowly through the house, but her routines held. Each spring, she walked to the cemetery and stood before the family plot where a stone bore William's name without a body beneath it. She brushed leaves from the base and traced the letters with her gloved hand. "There," she said once, to no one in particular. "That's his." I can't pretend to understand the discipline it takes to keep believing without evidence, but I can see how Catherine gave belief a physical shape, The stone, the light, the drawer of letters. The military correspondence slowed, then stopped. Years passed without new information. Catherine married and moved away but returned often, stepping back into the pattern as if she had never left. She learned to read her mother's moods by how often the telephone drawer was opened. When the final notice arrived, it was definitive. The investigation had concluded. Recovery was not possible. The phrasing was exact, the tone apologetic. Catherine read it once, then folded it smaller than necessary. "So that's it," Catherine said. Catherine looked up. "That's what they can do," she answered. The word on the page did not change Catherine's behavior. She continued to speak William's name in the present tense. She kept the notebook she had found among his things on the mantel, though she never opened it. She told Catherine she didn't need to read it to know what it contained. As years passed, William's name appeared elsewhere. Catherine learned of a memorial overseas, where names were carved for those without graves. She wrote to request confirmation. When the reply came, she read it aloud to her mother. "He's listed," she said. Catherine closed her eyes, relief and sorrow arriving together. The idea that William's name existed somewhere tangible mattered more than Catherine expected. It meant he was accounted for, even if he was not present. She asked Catherine to describe the wall as carefully as possible. Catherine obliged, mentioning the marble, the order, the way names stretched on without interruption. At home, the clock remained unwound. Dust gathered around its base. No one suggested fixing it. The stopped hands had become part of the room's language, a reminder that time did not move evenly for everyone. When Catherine died years later, Catherine stood alone in the kitchen, holding the drawer of letters for the first time. She read them in order, noticing how the tone shifted from reassurance to procedure. She found William's early note to her mother and read the line about counting weeks. She smiled despite herself. "There was nothing else we could have done," she said aloud, testing the sentence. It did not feel complete. The house was eventually sold. William's room was cleared. The notebook was placed in a box with his letters and the pocket watch that had been returned after Frank's death. Catherine kept these items with her, unwilling to discard the weight they carried. The record of William Everett Gray was thin. Dates, rank, a single classification. For decades, that thinness defined him publicly. Privately, he remained present through habit and memory, through objects handled carefully, through a clock that refused to move on. I can't pretend that waiting like this leaves no mark. It carved itself into Catherine's posture, into Frank's final months, into Catherine's sense of responsibility. The official record closed a file. It did not close the door. The first thing that drew attention wasn't a document. It was a name that didn't quite fit. The researcher noticed it late in the evening, the glow of a computer screen reflecting off a cluttered desk. Coffee had gone cold hours earlier. The query was simple: William Everett, Marine Corps, Pacific. But the results pulled in too much and too little at the same time. Names overlapped, dates blurred. One record pointed to Papua New Guinea in 1944. Another led to a naval disaster 2 years earlier. Both ended the same way, with the same administrative finality. "Something's wrong," the researcher said aloud, scrolling back up. The problem wasn't absence, it was confusion. In the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency database, William Everett produced multiple partial matches. One was a sailor lost aboard a cruiser at Guadalcanal. Another, thinner and harder to trace, was a Marine Corps officer listed without a middle name indexed properly. The discrepancy was small enough to be overlooked and large enough to derail everything. If the name was wrong, the search was wrong. The researcher pulled the ABMC records next. Manila American Cemetery. Wall of the missing. Row after row of carved names. There it was. Gray, William E. Rank listed. Marine Corps. Date of loss, matching the family's memory. Exactly. 11 June 1944. No photograph. No unit description on the wall itself. Just stone and order. Gray, the researcher said quietly. Not Everett. That single correction changed the direction of the entire case. I can't pretend I know the frustration of realizing decades of searching may have followed the wrong trail. But I can see how fragile these efforts are. How one misplaced name can turn commitment into exhaustion. The next step was elimination. The naval casualty from 1942 gunner's mate, 3rd Class William Everett Gray, had been lost with the USS Juno. His record was complete in its own tragic way. Ship sunk, all hands lost. Status sealed by eyewitness accounts, and wreck discovery. That was not this man. This isn't him, the DPAA specialist confirmed during a call. Different service. Different war moment. Different ending. The Marine Corps officer was someone else entirely. Second Lieutenant William Everett Gray. Officer service number beginning with an O. Aviation-related loss. Southwest Pacific. Aerial operations. The classification still read non-recoverable, but now it rested on the correct shoulders. The researcher printed the DPAA profile and spread it across the desk. Thin paper, sparse data. No unit listed publicly. No aircraft identified. Just rank, name, and the date that refused to move. This is why families get lost, the specialist said. If the name drifts, everything else follows. From there, the work turned methodical. ABMC confirmed the memorial status. The wall of the missing in Manila listed him among thousands whose remains were never identified. That placement mattered. It meant an official acknowledgement that the body had not been found, but also that the name was preserved deliberately, not forgotten. The researcher requested cross-referenced casualty lists from Marine aviation squadrons operating in Papua New Guinea during mid-1944. Pages arrived as scanned images, grainy and uneven. Some lists were handwritten. Others were typed with faded ink. Aircraft numbers appeared without context. Crew names were sometimes incomplete. The DPAA specialist warned against expectation. We're not looking for certainty, they said. We're looking for narrowing. You were part, not a capacity. Narrowing began with geography. In June 1944, Marine Corps aviation units in the region operated primarily from Emerau, Green Island, and Bougainville. Their missions focused on isolating Rabaul, striking airfields and shipping routes. Losses occurred not in large battles, but in routine operations. Flak bursts, mechanical failure, weather. William Gray fit that profile precisely. The researcher noticed something else while reading through mission summaries. Officers listed without aircraft type were often part of multi-crew platforms. That suggested he was not flying alone. Someone else had shared that cockpit, or that navigation table, or that narrow space behind the pilot's seat. If we find the aircraft, the researcher said, we find the people. But aircraft records from that theater were incomplete. Many planes were never recovered. Serial numbers disappeared into reports marked presumed destroyed. The DPAA specialist explained that post-war investigations had focused on accessible crash sites first. Jungle losses and deep water incidents were logged, then closed. They did what they could, the specialist said, with what they had. I can't pretend modern tools erase the choices made decades earlier, but I can see how technology reopens questions once sealed by necessity. The researcher pulled family genealogical data next. Morristown, New York, census records. A cenotaph listing William's name with his rank carved precisely. The headstone stood without a body beneath it, but it had been tended. Someone had brushed the lichen away. Someone had cared. A photograph surfaced through a local historical society, black and white, formal. William in uniform, young, serious. The collar insignia barely visible. It was the first image tied definitively to the correct man. That's him, the researcher said. More to the room than anyone else. Contact with surviving relatives followed. Descendants of Catherine Gray responded cautiously at first, wary of reopening something their family had learned to live alongside. They had heard the name, spoken with care, never certainty. The confusion over Everett versus Gray was familiar. It had misdirected earlier inquiries. We thought we were chasing the wrong person, one family member said during a call. You were, the researcher replied gently. But now we're not. That distinction mattered. DPAA confirmed that no DNA reference samples had been submitted under William Everett Gray's correct file. Any past attempts had stalled under the wrong classification. With the name corrected, the possibility of genetic comparison became real for the first time. If you want to proceed, the specialist said, this is where it starts. The family asked for time. They needed to talk among themselves, to decide how much hope they were willing to manage. Waiting had been inherited along with the name. The researcher returned to the digital records late that night. Manila, Morristown, Papua New Guinea. 3 places connected by paperwork and patience. The sound of rain against the window filled the silence of the office, steady and unhurried. I can't pretend discovery always feels triumphant. Sometimes it feels like standing at the edge of a deeper commitment. The final confirmation came quietly. An internal DPAA note acknowledged the corrected identity and updated the case status from dormant to review eligible. No promises, no predictions, just movement. Now we can ask the right questions, the specialist said. Which aircraft had been assigned that day? Who else had not returned? Where had the search ended, and why? The name no longer floated between records. It sat in one place, correctly, at last. William Everett Gray, Marine Corps. Officer, 11 June 1944. The discovery didn't answer what happened in the air. It didn't return a body, but it restored alignment between memory and record, between a family's loss and the institution meant to track it. For decades, the search had been bent slightly off course. Now it pointed forward, narrow and uncertain, but true. And for the first time since the telegram arrived, the file was open again. The reconstruction begins not with certainty, but with boundaries. Maps are spread across the table, their edges curling slightly from age. Flight paths traced in pencil arc out from island airstrips that no longer exist in the same form. The researcher runs a finger along one route, then another, pausing where the lines pass closest to Rabaul. The airspace there had been thick with danger, long after the ground war moved on. This is where crews got nervous, the DPAA analyst says, tapping the map once. Not because of fighters, because of what was still pointing up. Rabaul's anti-aircraft batteries were old, battered, but stubborn. Even in mid-1944, when Japanese air power in the region was largely neutralized, the ground defenses remained alert. Flak didn't need to be accurate, it just needed to be present. The most plausible aircraft profile begins to take shape through elimination. Single-seat fighters are ruled out first. Losses of that type were usually witnessed, sometimes even photographed. 2-man dive bombers narrow the field, but mission reports suggest their operations that week stayed closer to Bougainville. What remains are the medium bombers PBJ, one Mitchell's Marine Corps adaptations, of the B-25, flown low, heavily armed, and asked to do too much in hostile air. A PBJ crew carried weight beyond bombs. 5 to 7 men shared the space, each with a defined task, each dependent on the others. A second lieutenant like William Gray would not have been alone. He might have been a co-pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier, positions that required calm under pressure and the ability to make decisions quickly when plans collapsed. The analyst slides a mission summary across the table. Night harassment, he says, low altitude, coastal approach. Low altitude meant accuracy. It also meant exposure. Weather reports from that week add another layer. Afternoon storms rolled in without warning. Cloud ceilings dropping fast over water and jungle alike. Visibility could vanish in minutes. Returning crews sometimes flew blind, trusting instruments that lag behind reality. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to choose between pressing on and turning back when fuel is running low and the sky has closed in. But I can see how those choices shrink to seconds, and how they follow people long after. One reconstructed scenario places Gray's aircraft on a return leg from a harassment run along the New Britain coast. The crew would have been tired, adrenaline wearing off, ears still ringing from engine noise and distant bursts. Flak damage did not need to be catastrophic. A ruptured line, a compromised engine, something small enough to seem manageable until it wasn't. Most losses don't look dramatic on paper, the analyst says. They look survivable right up until they aren't. Another map is brought out, this one showing sea depth. The Bismarck Sea drops quickly, plunging beyond recovery range even by modern standards. If an aircraft ditched poorly or struck the water at speed, it would sink fast. In 1944, there would have been no way to mark the spot accurately, no beacon to guide a search. If the aircraft turned inland instead, the jungle presented its own erasure. Triple canopy forest closed over wreckage within weeks. Aluminum frames disappeared under vines. Fires burned hot, then cold. From above, nothing obvious remained. The analyst pauses, then adds quietly, sometimes villagers knew, sometimes they didn't tell. Sometimes no one ever walked that ridge again. A third scenario is considered and left open. Controlled flight into terrain. With cloud cover low and navigation limited, a pilot could misjudge altitude by seconds. Mountains rose sharply in Papua New Guinea, slopes unforgiving. Impact would leave little recognizable structure, especially after months of rain. None of these scenarios contradict the non-recoverable classification. They explain it. The reconstruction shifts from environment to people. Crew composition matters. Losses involving multiple men often left fragmented records, one name logged under an aircraft number, another under a mission code. If no one survived to file a report, the paper trail thinned fast. Do we have any overlapping losses that day? The researcher asks. The analyst nods slowly. There are gaps. 2 aircraft unaccounted for in that operational window. No confirmed wreckage. One of those gaps aligns with Gray's loss date. The decision points come into focus. Continue toward base with damage, or divert toward open water. Descend beneath cloud, or climb blind. Trust instruments, or trust instinct. None of these choices were made lightly. None were guaranteed to end well. I can't pretend reconstruction brings peace, but I can see how it replaces imagination with structure, how it gives shape to fear without amplifying it. The analyst pulls out a faded after-action report from a different squadron. Same month, same region. A surviving navigator describes flying through heavy weather, losing an engine, and making it back by chance rather than design. We were lucky, the report reads. Luck was the difference. Luck is not a strategy. It's a variable. If Gray's aircraft was hit and lost altitude quickly, the crew may have had moments enough time to register what was happening. Not enough to change it. There is no evidence of parachute deployment recorded. Over water, chutes were often useless. Over jungle, they could be fatal. The reconstruction does not claim survival. It does not claim immediate death. It leaves space where evidence ends. At the end of the session, the maps are rolled up carefully. The room smells faintly of old paper and dust. The analyst leans back, rubbing his eyes. We can't tell you exactly how it happened, he says, but we can tell you it wasn't careless. And it wasn't forgotten. That distinction matters more than it sounds. The reconstruction will be added to the case file as a working model, not a conclusion. It gives future searches direction, where to look underwater, which ridgelines matter, which aircraft losses should be re-examined together. As the researcher packs up, one last object is placed on the table. A reproduction of William Gray's flight notebook. Its cover worn smooth. Inside, on a blank page near the back, he had written a single word, after. No punctuation, no explanation. I can't pretend to know what he imagined that word would hold, but I can see how every reconstruction, every careful line on a map, is an attempt to honor it, to understand what stood between then and after, in the air over Papua New Guinea, on a day that never came home. The question that surfaces now is not technical. It is human. When the family agreed to submit DNA, it was not framed as a breakthrough. It was framed as a responsibility. The kit arrived in a plain cardboard box, light enough to feel almost dismissive of what it carried. Inside were swabs, instructions printed in careful language, and a return envelope already addressed. No promises, no encouragement, just procedure. One of Catherine Gray's grandchildren opened the box at the kitchen table. The wood was scarred from decades of use. Rings left behind by cups set down during long conversations. So this is it, she said quietly, turning the swab between her fingers. Her brother leaned against the counter. It's not an ending, he said. It's a door. And it was one down of recited minity. They followed the instructions exactly. Rinse, wait, swab, seal. The routine was oddly grounding, like completing a task that demanded focus but not emotion. When it was done, they set the envelope near the front door, beside keys and mail, where it stayed overnight. No one rushed to send it. Waiting, after all, was something the family understood well. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to hand over a piece of yourself, to answer a question that has lived longer than anyone in the room. But I can see how the act itself matters. It says, "We are still here, and we are willing to know." The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case spoke without embellishment. DNA doesn't tell a story, she said. It gives us a comparison. Sometimes that comparison leads somewhere. Sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't, a family member asked, then you still did what previous generations couldn't. That distinction settled in. The individual deceased personnel file arrived next. Hundreds of pages, digitized and uneven, some blurred at the edges, others typed so faintly they had to be enlarged to read. The family gathered around a laptop, scrolling slowly, stopping when the language grew too official. Search reports from 1944 and 45. Summaries written by men who had never known William Gray. Coordinates marked with margins wide enough to swallow entire valleys. One note referenced questioning local residents, when conditions allowed, then moved on without explanation. "This is thin," someone said. "It always was," another replied. The anthropologist explained how cases marked non-recoverable were shaped by the limits of their time. Search teams moved on foot. Aircraft wreckage disappeared into jungle or water faster than records could follow. Identification depended on tags, clothing, coincidence. But classifications aren't permanent, she added. They reflect a moment, not a truth. I can't pretend that sentence erases decades of waiting, but I can see how it reframes them. The DPAA specialist reviewed the corrected file and approved it for renewed consideration. On paper, it was a small change, a notation, a status update. In practice, it meant the case was no longer dormant. It could move again. The phrase, non-recoverable, shifted from final judgment to challenge. The family returned to Morristown that spring. The cenotaph stood where it always had, the stone pale against the grass. William's name was carved cleanly, his rank precise, the dates unchanged. One of Catherine's great-grandchildren rested her palm against the stone and felt the cold settle into her skin. "There's nothing under here," she said. "There never was," her mother answered. "That's why it exists." Is redenda batter. They stood without ceremony. No prayers spoken aloud. No photographs taken. Just a shared moment that did not require explanation. Later, the anthropologist spoke again, careful to set boundaries. Even if remains were located underwater, or inland identification could take years. And even then, the recovery might be incomplete. "We don't bring people back the way families imagine," she said. "We bring back what can be known." That sentence carried more weight than comfort. The family talked openly about what they wanted and what they did not. They did not expect closure in the dramatic sense. They did not expect certainty. What they wanted was alignment between record and memory, between the name on stone and the man they had been taught to remember. "If we find him," one descendant said, "we bring him home. And if we don't," another asked, "then we stop wondering if we failed him." I can't pretend that knowing is always kinder than not knowing, but I can see how uncertainty, stretched across generations, becomes its own burden. Months passed. The DNA profiles were added to the database. No immediate matches appeared. The DPAA sent a confirmation email, brief and factual. The data would remain active indefinitely, as long as it needs to, the specialist said. Life continued around the waiting. Jobs changed. Children grew. Conversations shifted away from the case, then returned to it without warning. The story of William Gray no longer lived only in the past. It existed in decisions being made now. The human truth of the case revealed itself slowly. It was not about remains. It was about permission. Permission to question a verdict handed down before modern tools existed. Permission to hope without demanding results. Permission to accept that dignity does not require a grave. William Everett Gray had shaped his family's behavior without ever returning home. He had taught them how to wait, how to preserve, how to ask carefully. Now, even without answers, the act of asking itself had changed something. I can't pretend this process heals loss, but I can see how it transforms it from a sealed record into a living responsibility. The clock that once stopped in Catherine Gray's kitchen no longer exists. The house has changed hands, but time, for this family, is no longer frozen at 8 minutes past 8. It moves now, unevenly, forward carrying William Gray with it, not as a missing body, but as a question finally allowed to breathe. The map is folded now. It lies in the researcher's bag, creased along the same lines every time, the paper softened by use. Papua New Guinea no longer feels abstract on it. Certain coastlines are worn thin by fingers tracing possibilities. Certain inland ridges have been circled, then circled again, until the pencil marks blur. There, the local guide says, pointing to a stretch of coastline on a newer satellite printout. His English is careful, learned through repetition. Old people talked about a plane. They are standing in a village near the water. Humidity pressing down. The air thick with salt and smoke from cooking fires. Chickens scatter as the group walks past. The guide gestures toward the sea, where the color shifts abruptly from green to deep blue. Ballast, he says, using the Tok Pisin word, long time ago. This detail had never appeared in any official record. The villagers do not know names, they do not know dates, but they remember sound. A roar overhead, a sudden absence where the noise should have continued. One elder recalls his father pointing toward the water and saying something that meant it didn't come back up. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to carry a memory passed down without context, but I can see how these fragments persist when paperwork fails. The researcher writes it down anyway, not as evidence, as presence. Back in the United States, Catherine Gray's great-grandson stands in a garage sorting through boxes he has never opened before. Most are ordinary tools. Old holiday decorations, faded clothing. One box is marked only letters. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, is William Gray's notebook. No one remembered it was still there. He sits on the concrete floor and opens it carefully. The pages smell faintly of age and oil. Most entries are mundane. Names, figures, half-finished thoughts. Near the back, between a sketch of a cockpit instrument and a list of supply requests, is something new. A pressed leaf, thin, brittle, carefully flattened between pages and left there. On the margin beside it, in William's handwriting, is a single word, Morristown. No one had mentioned this before, not in letters, not in family stories. He carried this with him, the great-grandson says quietly, holding the page open. All the way out there. This is the new human detail. Small, undeniable. The researcher adds it to the case notes, not because it changes the search area, but because it changes the man. William Gray did not leave home behind in theory. He carried it physically, folded thin enough to fit inside a notebook pocket. The DPAA specialist listens as the update is shared. That matters, she says. It tells us how he thought. Search feasibility is discussed next. The sea depth near the reported area exceeds practical recovery limits without a clear target. Jungle inland remains inaccessible without months of negotiation and risk. Funding cycles are limited. Priorities must be weighed. It may never be recovered, the specialist says, not unkindly. The family already knows this. They've rehearsed it privately. What we needed, one of Catherine's descendants says later, was to know where to stop imagining. End quote. Are due to dust. The village memory is recorded and archived. It does not trigger an expedition. It becomes part of the long record, one more thread, woven into a story that resists finality. In Morristown, the cenotaph remains. The stone has weathered, but the lettering holds. Each Memorial Day, someone still wipes it down. Not out of obligation, out of habit, inherited quietly. A neighbor once asked why the family kept tending a grave without a body. Because he existed, Catherine had answered years earlier. That's enough. I can't pretend I know how it feels to accept that an ending may never arrive. But I can see how acceptance does not mean forgetting. The notebook is returned to its box. The leaf stays inside, protected. The map stays folded. The DNA remains in the system. Active, patient, William Everett Gray's aircraft may still rest beneath deep water, metal softened by decades, undisturbed by anchors or nets. Or it may lie inland, its outline erased by growth, known only to those who heard stories long ago. What remains is not a conclusion. It is a set of objects handled with care. A name carved into stone in two places an ocean apart. A leaf pressed flat and carried farther than it ever grew. And in Morristown, on a quiet morning, someone pauses beside a clean stone, runs a hand over the letters, and says aloud softly, as if to make sure it still sounds right, William, because I was bendin' Dalagy. The name has not moved. It remains carved into marble in Manila, aligned with thousands of others, each one holding a story that did not return intact. It remains cut into stone in Morristown, New York, where there is still no body beneath it, only care passed quietly from one set of hands to the next. William Everett Gray was never found. That fact has not changed. But neither has this. He was never erased. I can't pretend I know what it means to live a life shaped by someone who never came home. But I can see how presence works differently than proof. A name spoken aloud. A notebook kept. A leaf pressed thin enough to survive distance and time. The file still says non-recoverable. Administratively, that door remains heavy. Yet the family no longer stands on the wrong side of it, guessing. They know who he was. They know where to look, even if they never arrive. The question that lingers is not about remains. It never was. When a soldier does not return, when a body never crosses the threshold back into familiar ground, the task of bringing them home shifts quietly to the living, to mothers who wait, to siblings who remember, to descendants who decide, decades later, that a name deserves to be said correctly. William Gray did not come back, but he was carried, and in the end, that may be the truest return any war ever allows.